Meshech Chochma will start here in Parshas Told Us, but there are a few things that we still didn't finish in Parshas Chayisora, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about Hanukkah, if not today, maybe next week. We're going to start with Perek Chav Zayin, Pasuk Chav Tes. And here, we are talking about the brachos of Yaakov. Let's just take a look at the pasuk inside. Yavducha mim v'yishtachavu lecha le'umim. And the word v'yishtachavu is written with one vav, chaser. And the Baal HaTurim comments on this kri ksiv. It's written ksiv with two vavs, but we enunciated kri as if there was only one vav. And the missing vav represents the 6 generations from Melech David to Yoram, during which time Esav Edom was subjugated to Klal Yisrael. And Yaakov, the bracha that Yitzchok bestows upon Yaakov, constitutes 26 words, the numerical value of the Yud Kei Vav Kei, implying that he used the Shema Mefarsh to bless Yaakov. Here we have a piece in the Meshech Chochma, and he says the following. It's a very small piece, but very interesting. There's Ksiv Chaser Vav, and it's written without a Vav. Second. Siv Chaser Vav, Rabbi Simcha is explaining the Korean Ksiv, again, in his own unique way. And he mentions here the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvahs Lo Taseh Mem Tes, and this is Mitzvahs Lo Taseh. And the Rambam writes that, just to summarize, Hashem prohibited us from keeping someone from the 7 nations alive. We have to Los Chaya Kol Neshama. So the people don't isolate themselves with such a person. He might incite them to Avodah Zarah. And one who violates this and does not kill them when it was possible for him to do so, he has violated a negative commandment. And this is all based on a pasuk in Dvarim in the 2nd chapter. Rak me'orei ha'amim ha'elu lo sechaya kol neshama ki hachrem tachrem. From these cities and these people, you shall not let a soul remain alive. Rather, you shall utterly destroy them, the Chitim, the Amorim, the Knanim, the Prizim, and so forth. Now, in Dvarim Zayin, if you take a look, Moshe tells the people that when Hashem brings them into Eretz Yisrael, he will thrust many nations before you, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And the Girgashi are included in this. And yet, in the later pasuk of Lo Sechaya Kol Neshama, the Girgashim were dropped. And Tosin Gittin on Daf Mem Vav, based on Yerushalmi and Shvius, quoting Reb Shmuel, tells us that prior to entering Eretz Yisrael, Yoshua sent 3 messages to the inhabitants. He gave them 3 options. They could either vacate the land, they're allowed to do so, or they could continue to live under Jewish subjugation, that they're allowed to do, or they can fight and go to battle. The Girgashim opted to leave and relocate to Africa. So the initial number of nations under the directive of Zechaya Kol Neshama was now reduced from 7 to 6. This is a very controversial view of Tosfos. According to other Rishonim, there's no discrepancy and no choice on the part of the 7 nations. So Rabbi Simcha now continues. He tells us about the Kriyan Ksiv, And that's hinting to these two future events. Although Yitzchok blessed Yaakov, Yavducha Amim v'yishtachu l'cholu umim, there will be nations that will not prostrate themselves to you because they'll be wiped out and the kiyum of Hachrim Tachrim also will be fulfilled, or they simply won't be in the country, like the Girgashim. So Rav Meir Simcha doesn't say it explicitly, but he seems to imply that by dropping the Vav in the Kri, he might be hinting to those 6 nations that will be destroyed. Now, Rav Meir Simcha always feels obligated to explain a Kri Uksiv from one parasha to a different parasha, and in this case, parashas Miketz. The Ache Yosef, when they returned to Mitzrayim this time, together with Binyamin, he quotes the pasuk that Vayiktu Vayishtachvu, and Vayishtachvu is written chaser, without the vav. Now the brothers present Yosef with a gift that they brought him from Yaakov, Vayishtachu lo arza, and they prostrated themselves to him toward the ground. Yosef then asks him about Yaakov. Is your aged father of whom you spoke at peace? They replied, your servant, our father, is at peace. And Vayishtachu Vayiktu. They bowed and they prostrated themselves. This time, we have the missing vav, the Kri and the Ksiv, Vayishtachavu and Vayishtachu. And Rav Meir Simcha explains this Kri and Ksiv. It's telling us that there was something missing. There was something different about this Ishtachavu. Says Rav Meir Simcha, in this Ishtachavu, only Binyamin bowed down. And this would explain why it was only at this point that Vayisa Einov Vayar Binyamin Achiv, Yosef lifted his eyes and he saw his brother Binyamin. For it was he alone, only Binyamin, who would prostrate himself. So the first Ishtachava, part of the presentation of the gift to Yosef, which was commanded by the brothers, by Yaakov, that didn't apply to Binyamin. So this is why only in the first Ishtachava does it say the word Arza, but not in the second one. The brothers had to appease Yosef, hoped that he would accept their gift, and therefore bowed to the ground. Binyamin did not, and therefore, to show respect to the viceroy of Egypt, he just did prostration without bowing to the ground. And says Rav Meir Simcha, notice that later Yaakov also does not bow to the ground to Yosef, as the pasuk tells us, Vayishtachu Yisrael al Rosh Hamita. Yisrael prostrated himself towards the head of the bed. Rav Meir Simcha adds clarity to an oddity in a previous pasuk in Parshas Vayeshev, where Yaakov incredulously tells Yosef, Avon navo anivi emecha ve'achecha l'shtachvos l'cha arza. Why does Yaakov mention the word arza? And at the end of the day, isn't it true that he and all of Yosef's brothers bowed down to him? But according to Rabbi Simcha, everything fits in beautifully. Yaakov was telling Yosef that his dream, Anivi imcha ve'achecha l'shtachvos l'cha arza, will not come true. Not arza, not for Binyamin, nor did Yaakov do a hishtachava arza. Now, as I mentioned before, there are 2 pieces in Chaisara that we missed. We'll see Vasher Diberli. This is in Perikov Daled Posuk Zayin. Mashlo Tziva es Yitzchok beno. Avram, we don't find, gave a command to Yitzchok as Yitzchok did to Yaakov. Shelo Yisa Isha mibnos haknani. Umikan raya l'shita samarik. If you're a Ramoy or a Terech Mem, dehaben ein chayav l'chmali aviv im mochebo milisa isha chukafetz. A father cannot object and block the possibility from his son to marry the girl that he wants to marry. And therefore, Avram did not command Yitzchak, don't marry from the Bnos Canaan. So now you'll ask the kasha, Umad etziva Yitzchok Yaakov lo tzikach icha mibnos haknani. At the end of Parshas Toldos, Yitzchok tells Yaakov not to marry mibnos haknani. Hu mipnei Omar lo, because in Pasuk Dalet in the same chapter, Vayiten lecha es birchas Avram l'chol zarcha achrecha l'rishtecha es eretz b'recha shenosan elokim li'Avram. Now, with regard to this promise of giving the birchas Avram over to Yaakov, there was a precondition. It says, "V'nasati l'cha u'lezarcha achrecha es eretz Canaan v'yisi lachem le'elokim le'elokim." And the Gemara in Yevamos on Daf Kuf says, "Lo tisev knanis v'shivcha, de lo lezel zaracha basra." So it means that if a chas v'shalom, a Jew marries a non-Jewish woman, then the child is not Jewish. In kenu t'nai. Yitzchok is saying that Avram Avinu made a t'nai that the bracha should be given only to those who have zaracha achrecha. And if you'll marry a bas Kanani, that fulfillment, that Tanai will not be fulfilled. V'chein amar lo Yitzchak, shelo sikach mibnos haknani, v'yachul alecha birchas Avram. Therefore, Yitzchak tells Yaakov that if he'll marry a girl from the Bnos HaKnani, then he will forfeit the birchas Avram, because the birchas Avram to be Nochel Eretz Yisrael was established conditional on the fact that the children, Acharecha, will be able to inherit the land. God gave Avram the land of Israel as a gift only on condition that Avram Avinu would be able to pass on that nachla to his children and his grandchildren. And therefore, Avram Avinu would have to marry a Sarah, Yitzchok, Rivka, and if Yaakov would marry Bnos Canaan, then there's no way that God's command that the land should be given from one generation to the other would be fulfilled. Therefore, says Rameir Simcha, Mishum Zeh Omar, Vayar Esav at the end of Parshas Toldos, Ki Berech Yitzchok es Yaakov, Shalacho so Paden Aram Lakachas Lo Misham Isha, and Esav is standing on the sidelines, and he observes that Yitzchak commands Yaakov to go to Padan Aram. Don't marry a girl from Bnos Canaan. Bibarcho Osam. And the Torah adds those two words, Bibarcho Osam. The command of Yitzchak to Yaakov not to marry Bnos Canaan is connected by the pasuk to the bracha. Vayitzav a love leimar lo sikach isha b'Bnos Canaan. How is this connected to the bracha? She'ein zeh mitzvah shemitzava. It's not a command of a father to the son that Yitzchak commands his father al skiburav that he should marry a girl from Bnos Canaan. In fact, tonight b'barcha osam. It's a condition in the bracha. The bracha of Avram, which is now being passed down from Yitzchak to Yaakov, is conditional on the fact that Yaakov marries a girl mipadan Aram and not from Bnos Canaan. Shem lo yishmei love. If Yitzchak tells Yaakov that if you won't listen to this, then ein havracha kayemes, that the bracha will not be fulfilled because it was contingent on the fact that the land would be l'zarach achrecha. And as we saw from the Gemara in Yevamos, the Gemara says lo tesev knanis, if he would marry a knanis, the lo lezel zaracha basra, that the child would be considered a non-Jewish child. It won't be considered your child. There's no yufsin through a non-Jewish woman. And therefore, the condition of this bracha, birchas Avram, lecha u'zarach achrecha, will not be fulfilled. But, says Rameir Simcha, as far as Kibbutz Av is concerned, It would be outside of the purview of a father to command his son, don't marry a certain girl. And Rabbi Simcha builds himself on the Chuvas Marik, which is codified by the Ramah and Yoredeya, that there is a limitation to kibbud av, and the exception to the rule is marriage, that the child can marry Misha Libo Chafetz. But Yitzchok, although not Bidin Av, can command Yaakov and demand that he doesn't marry Bnos Khan, but Midin Birchas Avram. Yaakov, you're at a choice situation. You can decide whether you want the Birchas Avram or you don't. If you marry a Bnos Canaan, Mazel Basra, she will not be, and her children will not be Zaracha. And therefore the promise of the Birchas Avram would not have been fulfilled. It was contingent on Zaracha. Therefore, Tikach Isha mi Bnos Canaan. How are you today, Daniel? I'm sorry, I can't hear you right now, but I started a little bit before. I hope you don't mind. And we're looking at a piece in Chayei Sarah that we weren't able to fit in last week, and I thought it would be a nice introduction to Parshas Toldos. In the episode of Eliezer searching for the proper wife for Yitzchok, there's a piece here that I think gives us an insight into Yaakov Avinu and the relationship between Yitzchok on the one hand and Rivka as a marriage partner on the other hand, and Yaakov as the child, the offspring of that marriage. So we're opening up to the end of Parshas Chayei Sarah as an introduction to Parshas Toldos, and we're looking at Perek Chaf Daled, Pasuk Yud Daled. Vayah hanara asher omari leo hatina kadech v'ashteh b'omer shesei v'gam gamalech hashteh osa hochachta liyavdecha liyitzchak uba eda ki asisa chesed im Adoni. And we're going to underline the word chesed. Now, Rameir Simcha has two phrases in his work on Chumash as to how to interpret psukim. One is called Al Derech HaPshat, and the other is called Al Derech HaEmes. The latter are very rare in Rameir Simcha, from my experience at least, in which Rameir Simcha says, let's leave out the pshat in the pasuk, that Eliezer is talking about the great chesed of Hashem, that Hashem helped Eliezer find the right suitable candidate for Yitzchak. But on a deeper level, what did Hashem present to Eliezer, Rivka? He presented a girl who was chesed. Uperusho al derech ha'emes, ki Yitzchak midas hagvura. Now, derech ha'emes, he doesn't tell you what sources he's quoting, but in my mind, he is quoting probably the Zohar. And the Zohar is famous for dividing up the avos and the imos into various spheros and midos. And Yitzchak is a personification of the midah of gvura. Umistabekos gvura im hachesed. Now, there's going to be a hisdabkus, an integration or a synthesis between the midah of gvura of Yitzchak and the midah of chesed of Rivka. And that's what Eliezer is intimating here when he uses the word chesed in this pasuk. V'naseh, as a result of the integration of gvura and chesed, Briach HaTichon means the the foundations, in this case, the foundations of Knesset Yisrael, emes. From Gvura and Chesed, we get emes. V'lachein, kasher hirgish berivka midas Chesed, when Eliezer becomes aware of the fact that Rivka personifies Chesed, Omar, he declares, right here in this parsha, Baruch Hashem, asher lo azav chazdo v'amito, that he gave us Chesed as an admixture to Yitzchok, and that's in the form of Rivka, and Amito. Amito as a result of this marriage and this synthesis of Gvura and Chesed, we're going to get emes. Shenolad midas ha'emes mi'ismazgus Chesed u'Gvura. Emes is the byproduct, so to speak, of the combination, the integration of these two great midos of Gvura and Chesed. Zuhi midaso shel Yaakov. And therefore, when Rivka comes to see Yitzchok the first time, the Torah emphasizes Vatisa Rivka, Rivka meaning Chesed, Esenea, Vateres Yitzchok, Vatipol me'al hagamal, Midas Pachad Yitzchok. She is overwhelmed by the Pachad of Yitzchok, which the Torah speaks about the Pachad of Yitzchok. Bezeu mi ha'ish halazeh halech lasadeh otzem hadinim vatiskas. She is overwhelmed when she sees Yitzchok. It's an encounter with the midah of Gvura, of Pachad Yitzchok. And she realizes at that moment that she was designated to marry into Pachad Yitzchok, into Gvura, bringing Chesed, so that the marriage between them would create the next link in Knesset Yisrael, namely the mid of Emes, the mid of Titein Emes Yaakov, of Yaakov.
I'm not clear as to how that combination works. Why does that Gvura plus Chesed equal Emes? I don't quite see the equation. I'm not a great mathematician, so.
Right. This is what he calls al pi derech Emes. And what it means is that Emes has to always judge all the different factors. Ultimate truth is when you allow weighing in all the antinomies, all that which is antithetical. You have one great midah, but it's antithetical to another great midah. Emes is the ability to combine them and show that they work in tandem. Like, for example, if God creates the world with chesed, like the pasuk says, Olam chesed yibaneh, it means that we receive chesed that's undeserved, which is called nama de chisufa, that we are humiliated by the fact that we're receiving a gift gratis that we don't deserve. Now we move over to another midah, which is antithetical to chesed, and that's din, which means that God's not going to give us anything unless we absolutely deserve it. That's midas hadin. As a result, we don't have nama de chisufa. We're not going to suffer the humiliation of receiving something that we don't deserve. But on the other hand, HaKadosh Baruch Hu realizes that the man can't exist with the midah of din, because if we're only going to get that which we deserve, Ein Tzadik B'Aretz, we're going to fall short. So therefore, God adds chesed to din. In certain situations, chesed is primary. In other situations, din is primary. But ultimately, all these dimensions have to work together to create one whole. For example, we find that the midah of chesed of Avram Avinu was taken to an extreme by Lot, and his midah of chesed was a deviation of chesed, of true chesed. As a result of chesed that went berserk, so to speak, it went too extreme, we get in the next generation Yishmael. Yishmael is a product of an extreme chesed, and that has to do with Arayos and Yishmael. In the next generation, we have Yitzchok, and that's pure din. And if it's not mitigated by chesed, then we get an Esav from that. Esav is pure din. And Yaakov Avinu, which is called the Mid of Emes, Titein Emes Yaakov, is when you have these various antithetical midos that work together as a synthesis to create a perfect whole. That's why it says that Tmutz Yaakov Avinu chakuka tachas kisei hakavod, and there's no psolas from Yaakov. Bitaso Shlema has 12 shvatim; they're all tzaddikim, because there's no midah that was taken too much to an extreme. In Yaakov, it was the perfect blend of emes. Obviously, there are layers and layers of deeper meaning here, but that's just on a superficial level.
So effectively, Midas Adin on its own is not emes.
Midas
Maybe
Adin,
Shemayim. Maybe it's different in Shemayim and Oretz.
Correct. Down here on Oretz, there's a different concept of emes. It's an emes that reflects also chesed. Otherwise, we couldn't survive. Now I want to show you another point in Rameir Simcha. And this is in Parshas Toldos. Well, again, it's at the end of Chaisara, but it's the introduction to Toldos. We're looking now in Perek Chav Daled, Pasuk Samach Zayin. Vayivieha Yitzchok hohela Sora imo, vayikach es Rivka, vatehilo leisha vayeehaveha. And Rabbi Simcha is going to underline the word vayehaveha. And I've said this many, many times. The commentary of the Meshech Chochma is a blend of pshat, of what we saw now, derech emes, and halacha. Very often, Rameir Simcha, through his halachic thinking cap, sheds a light on the parsha, and that's what we're going to see now. He starts by quoting a Yalkut, and the Yalkut says that in the previous pasuk, the Torah describes Rivka falling off the donkey when she sees Yitzchok. And the Yalkut comments that Kshenafla Rivka, when Rivka fell, Nashru B'Suleha, as a result of the impact on the ground, she lost her B'Sulit, so she doesn't have Dam B'Sulit. And this is going to be a problem for Rameir Simcha on a halachic level. Why? Because Yitzchok has to marry a Basula. And the Torah goes out of its way to describe Rivka as a Basula. And leave this question for a moment, why Yitzchok has to marry a Basula. But he quotes a Tosfos in Ksubis. And this Tosfos we don't have, but it's quoted by, but Tosfos and Ksubis quote Rabbeinu Chananah. What's the status of a Mukas Eitz who doesn't have Dam B'Sulit? Is she a Basula or is she not? And although many Rishonim reject this Rabbeinu Chananel is of the opinion that Mukas Eitz Pischa Na'ul. Na'ul means she still is a Besula. And if that be the case, would we accept Rabbeinu Chananel? It would shed a new light on the pasuk here, which says Vaye'eha Veha, which means Kishabale Masa Pischa Na'ul. And why is that so? Vayehaveh means that Yitzchok realized that the marriage was halachically valid. V'yanire Yitzchok haya kohen gadol shahaya begeder kodesh hakadoshim. The Medrash Rabbah says that Yitzchok could not leave Eretz Yisrael, and the pasuk says, "Shchon ba'aretz hazos." Shchon is the language of Shechina, and the Shechina that demands Yitzchok to remain is the Shechina of the Kodesh Kadoshim, and that means that when Yitzchok was taken on the Akedah, he gained the status of a Kohen Gadol l'fnai v'l'fnim. U'mivnei zelo haya rashoy lotzeis mi'eretz Yisrael. V'lachein nira me'agemara Yevamos, daf samach aleph amud beis, the Rivka nara havi. Now this is fascinating. I always believed that Rivka was 3 years old. But that's not so, says Rav Yosef, because she was actually 12 years old. I mean, you'll have to see all the parshas later on and see how to calculate this. She was a Nara. And she was a Nara Besula. Therefore, she was of the perfect age to marry Yitzchok, who had the status of a Kohen Gadol and had to marry a Besula. So we have two dinim that apply to Yitzchok because he is classified and defined as a Kohen Gadol. Number one, he's not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. And number two, he has to marry a Nara Besula. Says Rav Meir Simcha, this will shed a new light on Eliezer's response to Lavan and Besuel, who said, Teshev na Nara, what was the language there? But it says Asar, which means come back in 10 months and we'll organize this wedding. The Imhim Tinu Asar, Eliezer was saying that if they would wait 10 months, and Nara is only 6 months until she becomes a Bogeres, Teshev Nara Itanu Yomim O Asar, then ein bein naros lebagus rak shich chadoshim bilvad. V'im havoy b'eis hanesuin bogeres, if at the time of the marriage she would be a bogeres because they delayed the marriage by 10 months, and she's a bogeres, not a nara, haya asur ba. Yitzchok would not be allowed to marry her because the Torah commands a Kohen Gadol, Isha Besula me amav yikach isha. Ubesula begil narus kaskinon. She can only be a besula during the narus period. Once she has the status of a bogeres, she no longer has the status of a besula. And therefore, says Rav Meir Simcha, we now understand two things. Number one, we understand that even though she fell on the ground and lost her besulin, if we activate Rabbeinu Chananel, then according to that opinion, Pischa Na'ul, she still retains the status of a Bisula, and therefore you have Vayaveh, meaning that this marriage was made in heaven, because Yitzchok as a Kohen Gadol would have to marry Bisula, which according to Rabbeinu Chananel, he in fact could, even though she was a Mukad Eitz. In fact, there's a medrash that says that she did have down Besulin, and the Malachim actually put it on the side so that Yitzchok would see it later on to make sure that we could calm him down that she was a basula. And number two, now we begin to understand the new light on why Eliezer said we can't postpone the wedding, because since, as Tosa says in Yevamos, Rivka was a Nara, if we were to wait the 10 months, she would be a Bogeres by definition, and she's no longer a Basula, and hence she would be Asura al HaKohen Gadol, in this case, on Yitzchok. But now Rameir Simcha says, what about all the other Rishonim who say that a Mukat Eitz is no longer Basula? And if we assume that Rivka was a Mukat Eitz because she fell onto the ground, etc., then how could Yitzchok marry her? I mean, we have a very good answer according to Rabbeinu Chananel, but the Rishonim never accepted Rabbeinu Chananel. And a Mukat Eitz gets a ksuba of a Meah and not Messiah. She's not a Basula. Says Rameir Simcha, Aval Mukas Eitz V'Eitz Nesuin Mutter. Unbelievable. A new Chiddush of Rameir Simcha L'Alach to justify Yitzchak marrying Rivka. And the emphasis here is on V'Eitz Nesuin, which means that, as Rabbi Simcha says elsewhere, when Eliezer gives gifts to Rivka, and Rivka accepts those gifts, that itself was Kedushin. When Eliezer takes Rivka back to Ohel Sarah, right, meaning Ohel Yitzchak, at that point, they clinched the Nesuit. And during this entire period of time, between Eliezer's first encounter, his meeting with Rivka, and Rivka going into the Ohel of Sarah, during that period of time was a period of Erison. Says Rameir Simcha, if she became a Mukat Eitz before entering the Ohel, she was not a Mukat Eitz at the time of the Kedushin, but rather at the time of the Nesuit. Mutter. Then the Kohen Gadol is allowed to marry her, meaning Nesuin, if she became a Mukat Eitz after the Erison. The Lo Ishtani Gufa, that's a Gemara in Yevamos, or I don't know if we have time for that now, but anyway, but here's the punchline. Vahavi ke'ires almana. Imagine if a Kohen Hedjot is ma'ares and almana with Erison, which he's allowed to do, but before he got to the Suin, they appointed him as the Kohen Gadol. And Tosa says that he doesn't have to divorce his wife. He can take her into the Suin, even though she was an almana, because she was not an almana that was Asura Olam. So the Kedushin was valid. He married a Kohen Hedjot, married an almana, and now he can take her into the Suin. And therefore the same thing will apply to a Mukat Eitz, unless she's a Bu'ula Mamish. But anyway, if Lo Nishtani Kufa, between the Erison and the Nesuin, then he, and in this case Yitzchok as a Kohen Gadol, is allowed to take her into the Suin. Very interesting. Now, we discussed another piece in Rabbi Simcha in Parshas Toldos. So I'm not going to go through it again, but I don't think you heard it, so I'll give you like the highlights of it. And that is on Rabbi Simcha on the Pasuk Yavducha Amim Yishtachu L'Cholumim. It's Perek Chav Zayin, and it's Pasuk Chav Tes. The word Vayishtachu has what's called a Kri and a Ksiv. The Ksiv has two Vavs, Vayishtachu. v'yishtachavu. But it's read, the Kri is vayishtachu, with one vav. And the Baal Turim has a whole discussion about this. But Meir Simcha has his own twist. And he's going to try to make a parallel between this case of Kri Uksiv in Vayishtachu and the same Kri Uksiv in the brothers of Yaakov, the brothers of Yosef, when they come down to Mitzrayim and they bow down to Yosef, to the viceroy of Mitzrayim. Anyway, in this context, he says that Yitzchok bestows a blessing upon Yaakov that Avducha Amim, the nations that occupy the country of Canaan, will serve you, and they will bow down to you. But the Torah, in the Ksiv, leaves out the Vav. Why? And Rabbi Simcha has a brilliant chap over here. How many nations are being discussed indicated in this bracha? The nations that occupied Palestine, if you will. 7, correct? There were 7 nations. But the number Vav is being emphasized here because only 6 out of those nations would bow down, so to speak, to the descendants of Yaakov. Which nation do we subtract? The Girgashi. Why? Lirmo sheish umos chaserim. There's 6, but it's chaser because we're missing the other vav. Asher lo sechaya kol neshama, from the original command that we will defeat and destroy the 7 nations. 1 nation is missing, and that's indicated by the vav. The Girgashi panalaf li'afriki. When Yoshua, the Yerushalmi tells us, offered the nations, the 7 nations, an option of leaving, they could just simply pack out. Only 1 out of the 7 took Yoshua up on his offer, and that was the Girgashi. They went to Africa. Interesting. Therefore, when the Bnei Yaakov, the descendants Zera Yaakov, will experience the fulfillment of this blessing that Yitzchok bestowed upon Yaakov, that the nations will bow down to you, it's only going to be 6 nations, those 6 nations that decide to stay in the land, but not 7 nations, because one of the nations has packed out. And a parallel case he finds in Vayikdu Vayishtachu. And who is that a reference to? That's only a reference to Binyamin. And therefore it's written Chaser to teach us that the other brothers had previously, in the previous pasuk, bowed down to Yaakov. To Yosef. And now the only brother who did not bow down to Yaakov, I made the same mistake to Yosef, was Binyamin. And Rabbi Simcha proves that this was Yaakov's proof to Yosef when he had the dreams, that he was mistaken about the dreams. Because in the dreams, Yosef dreams that all of his brothers would bow down Arza. And that was fulfilled with regard to all the brothers except for Yosef, except for Binyamin, because Binyamin only prostrated himself, but he didn't bow down to Arza, he didn't fall onto the ground. That's why the word Arza is missing in that pasuk, which refers exclusively to Binyamin. All right.
So I have to go. Good Shabbos.
Okay, have a good Shabbos. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let's take a look at something for Hanukkah, just as a sort of like a little taste of Hanukkah. This is Rav Meir Simcha in Breishis Lamed Zayin Pasuk of Tal. Hadim Avarech al Der Chanukah, the bracha of Ner Chanukah, and this I share with you in honor of today's Rosh Chodesh Kislev. Mishum shenasa nes b'pach Hashem. So there is a supernatural miracle that takes place that defies the law of nature with the Pach Hashem. V'zeh neged hateva. Now, says Rav Meir Simcha, the main primary miracle of Chanukah is not the Pach Hashem, by far not. Ikar hanes nitzachon l'malchus Antiochus or Antoninus. V'Yisrael kiblu melucha masayim shana. So that's the main miracle, that the Jewish people were able to restore their dominion, their independence over the land for 200 years. Ulezichron tzarich lahayir neros. And we light candles as a memory for that great miracle of the military defeat of the enemies, of the Greeks, of Malchus Antonios. He says, in order to fulfill that zecher to the great nest, the primary nest of the Nitzachon, it would be enough to light candles anywhere. Achlahoros al nes pach hashemen. Now we have a loch that Ner Chanukah has to be below 20 amma, and that's in order to demonstrate the ness of the Pach Hashemen. Tzarich dafka diehei sholta ba'ena toch esrim amma. So it's interesting. We have Neros lezecha nitzachon, but we have the Ner Chanukah with all its unique dinim and with a special bracha for the nest that's lamala min hateva that took place in the Pach Hashemen. V'remez lezeh shayim meir b'tocha heichal u'pischo shel heichal gavoa chaf amo. V'lezeh nismechu shnei mamorei Rabbi Tanchu. So there are two mamorim Rabbi Tanchu. One has to do with Ner Chanukah l'malam v'yesrim, and the other about Yosef getting thrown into the bar. And hu Rabbi Tanchuma to be medrash kayadua lahoro shebechanukah b'Yosef. In both cases, hanes haya hasibas hashgacha nitzachon umalucha. That the nes, the miracle, was indicative of the great divine providence that would facilitate, in the case of Chanukah, the nitzachon over the enemies, in the case of Yosef, the malucha. So in the case of Yosef, Yosef comes back to the bar and he makes a bracha. That bracha is on the fact that supernaturally a miracle happened and the Nechashim down there in the bar did not kill Yosef. Here, when it comes to Chanukah, the bracha was established on the Pach Hashemen, which is a nes Lamala Minatev. So that'll serve as an introduction in Mirz Hashem to the insights of the Meshech Chochma on Chanukah. So let me take this opportunity to wish you a Shabbat Shalom, Parshas Tov.